We're going to work on two graphs. The first one is a pressure graph of the left side of the heart. And then the next slide, we're going to look at volumes. So let's begin by looking at pressures. This is a graph that represents three places. The ventricle is in blue. That's going to be kind of the most important pressure, is to look at that blue one and compare it relative to the pressure in the atria and the pressure in the aortic. And what I use this graph for is to help us understand valves. Valves open and close based on pressure differences on each side of the valve. So for instance, when we're looking at a mitral valve, which is the AV valve, the atrioventricular valve of the left side of the heart, we're looking at the pressure on one side, say the atria side, versus the ventricular side. And when pressure is greater on the atrial side, that valve is open. It's going to open up into the ventricle. When the pressure in the ventricle goes above the atrial pressure, that's going to close the valve. So it's much like opening a door. When you open a door, it's because you put pressure on one side of it. When you close a door, it's because you put pressure on the other side of it. So it's just alternating where the higher pressure is going to determine whether that valve opens or closes. Okay, we're going to go slowly through this graph. There's 4 time points that are most important, and that's when valves are opening and closing. So when we hit one of those time points, I want you to look at the pressure on each side of the valve. So we begin with atrial systole. This time period here is atrial systole. So atria are contracting, ventricles are relaxed. During that process, or that period, the pressure in the atrium exceeds pressure in the ventricle. Or said another way, the pressure in the ventricle is below the atrial pressure. That's shown right here. So we want to think about what's occurring there. Well, if pressure is greater in the atrium than the ventricle, the mitral valve must be open and blood is filling the ventricle during atrial systole. This vertical solid line represents the onset of ventricular contraction. And right at that onset of ventricular contraction, the pressure in the ventricle goes above the pressure in the atrium. And when ventricular pressure exceeds atrial pressure, it closes that mitral valve. So almost immediately, right at the onset of ventricular contraction, the mitral valve closes, and that should make sense because we don't want to eject blood into the atrium. We want to close that valve. From that vertical solid line to this vertical dashed line is that short little duration where all the valves are closed. Semilunar valves have been closed. We just closed the mitral valve, so everyone's closed. What that allows the ventricle to do is build pressure. Build pressure until the pressure in the ventricle can exceed the pressure in the aorta. Once that happens, that aortic valve flies open and we can eject blood. Notice during this ejection period, the blue line, the ventricular pressure, is always above the aortic pressure. Then, as that ventricle goes from contraction to relaxation, the pressure in the ventricle drops below the pressure in the aorta, and that's going to close that aortic valve. So now we're in relaxation and all valves are closed again, and no volume changes, so it's called isovolumetric. The ventricle is relaxing, so it's isovolumetric relaxation. Pressure in the ventricle drops, 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 drops. Once the pressure in the ventricle drops below the atrial pressure, once again, the mitral valve is going to then open. And once that mitral valve is open again, we can begin refilling the ventricle. So this is the refilling that occurs during relaxation. Then we're going to get to the next cycle again. The mitral valve is still open because the pressure in the atrium is greater than the pressure in the ventricle. And we're going to top off. We'll be able to add that 20% of volume again. So again, this graph may help. This graph might confuse you even more. But I think if you look closely just at those 4 time points where valves are either opening or closing and looking at the pressure, it should make sense. There's some other little waves that occur in the atrial line, an A, C, and V. I'm not going to hold you to those, but there's an A wave. When the atria contract, obviously the pressure in the atrium goes up. There's a C wave when the mitral valve bulges. That produces a little wave of the atrial pressure, and then there's a V wave. But I'm not going to hold you to these. What I'd like you to focus on is knowing why valves are opening and closing. The next graph is volumes. So this is a graph that, again, shows more than one thing. It shows your volume changes, and this volume line will be the same in both sides, left and right. Kind of lined up with an ECG. Again, the ECG kind of helps you know where you are. Are you atrial systole? Are you ventricular systole? Or are you relaxation period? And then it lines up some heart sounds. So let's begin again right at the start here. And if we look over at the volume, we would be at 105. So 105 is the volume in a ventricle just prior to atrial systole. Once we enter atrial systole, how do we know we're entering atrial systole? There's a P wave. That atrial systole is going to add 20% of the total volume. So we're going to go from 105 to 300. So that was the addition of the 25 milliliters during atrial systole. That brings us to the maximum, at least for this heart, of 130. That's the full, and that we call end diastolic volume because the ventricle is at the end of relaxation. So it has 130 milliliters in it. Then we're going to enter ventricular systole. How do we know? There's a QRS. And when the ventricle contracts, it's going to pump out blood. It's going to pump out stroke volume, which we would have to subtract from this volume. So we pump out 70. And what are we left with? We are left with 60. So we have the full ventricle at 130. We pump out the 70, which is called stroke volume. What's left behind is the 60, which we call end systolic volume, because that's the volume at the end of ventricular contraction. Then we enter relaxation. How do we know? The ventricle has repolarized because of a T wave. When that ventricle relaxes, we can begin the refilling process during relaxation to get us back up to 105 again. So from this time point to this time point, we add an additional 45 milliliters to go from 60 back to 105 so we can start a new cycle again at the atrial systole period. So again, hopefully graphs help. Some students despise graphs and don't like to look at them. But if you think a graph will help your understanding with these volume changes, this would be a good one to use. Your book has a bunch of them all kind of lined up. So this one has, all these parameters. The top, they show an ECG because that kind of helps you understand where you are. They've color-coded the 3 periods: atrial systole, ventricular systole, and relaxation. So now you know based on those colors where you are. Then they have the pressure graph showing the 3, really important places being your left atrium, your left ventricle, and your aorta. They line up the heart sounds. So the two most important heart sounds are S1 and S2. Those are where valves are closing. Either the AV valve closes at S1 or the semilunar valve closes at S2. Lines up the volume changes. So now you can see those really important volume numbers. The 105 before atrial systole, the 130 at ventricular systole, then pumping out stroke volume, which was the 70, and leaving behind end systolic volume. Then, very important, is to be able to refill during relaxation and then topping off during atrial systole. And then finally, they show what the heart looks like at each of those steps along the way. So this is probably the hardest video because it's going to really challenge your ability to understand these different events in the cardiac cycle. In the last video we're going to talk about how we measure heart function, and then we're going to talk about some things that affect how much blood your heart is pumping.